Welcome back to Spey Casting with Jon. I'm Jon Hazlett of the Ashland Fly Shop. I'm going to cover faults and fixes. We all mess up at times. If you know the fix, if you can recognize the fault, you know the fix, it's just going to make your day better. So get comfy, grab a cold one, tune in. Thanks for watching. So one of the major faults is trunking. And that is just simply when your rod comes back too far in your what's called the key position. You know, the key position is your casting position. If your rod comes back too far, you're going to have too much D-loop on the water or too much anchor on the water, not enough D-loop. And it's a tough one to fix, but I think when it happens the most is when the caster does what we call cutting the corner. So if I do a double spey, for example, as I come around, if I cut the corner here, I'm likely to lay my rod back too far, okay? As opposed to coming around and up to my key position, okay? From here to here, it's known as the swivel to the key position. So if you find yourself coming back, trunking, and you've got too much line stick, you've got too much of an angle on your rod, it's too flat, go through your little mental checklist. Make sure that your rod comes around and up to the key position, and make sure you're not what we call cutting the corner back to here, okay? So that's one way to kind of monitor that. Some of these faults are hard to pick up from the caster's perspective. They're easy to see when I'm watching you, but it's hard to pick up. So that's one little thing. And since we're talking about the D-loop stroke, Chris King, great instructor, great caster out of Reading, he uses the analogy of the tray of drinks. I've got a tray of drinks and I'm going to put them on my shoulder and deliver them to the table. And you don't want to spill them. So if I cut the corner, I'm going to spill those drinks right on my head, okay? So that swivel to the key position, you're putting that tray of drinks right up here, that should take care of that issue. Another issue is hooking. Hooking basically means when I come around, instead of stopping here, my rod continues around behind me, okay? This is probably the toughest one to identify and fix. And again, your hands in your key position, your top hand, you know, especially if you have a schedule line, should be about cheek level, and your bottom hand should be right out in the middle of your body, right here. So if I'm hooking, you know, my top hand is going to be closer to my face, and my bottom hand is going to be pushed out too far, okay? It's going to be pushed out too far. When I'm trying to break someone's habit of hooking, I make them watch the rod tip. If you can't stop hooking, one fix is to watch the rod tip all the way to its stopping point. And if you can still see the rod tip, you're probably not hooking. Once you've hooked, it's almost impossible without leaning back to see that rod tip stop, okay? So if you're trying to fix your own problem, follow that rod tip around, right to the stopping point. If you can still see the rod tip, you're probably not hooking, okay? So there's a little fix there. Another problem is stroke length, okay? When you make a casting stroke, whether it's a single-handed rod, two-handed rod, we've all heard 10 and 2. You know, our back cast, so to speak, is here, and our forward cast here, you know, 10 and 2. We've all heard that, whether you're using a single-handed rod or a two-handed rod. And, you know, and sometimes all these faults happen at the same time, but stroke length is key because a nice short stroke gives you a tight loop, okay? And a tight loop is efficient, cuts through the wind, turns your fly over. We all want that. So if my rod comes back too far in my back cast when I make my D-loop and forward too far, I'm going to have a lot of issues, but mainly it's going to create an open loop, and an open loop doesn't transfer the energy, doesn't cut through the wind, doesn't turn your flyover as well. Okay. So how do I fix that? A lot of it's self-monitoring. You know, the trunking issue is basically the rod coming back too far. When I make my forward cast, if I hear that slurping, that ripping off the water, I know my rod's back too far. So that should tell me right there that that part of the cast, my stopping point was too far back. So if I swivel to the key position properly, you know, if I just put the rod in my hand here, my rod's at the perfect angle. So if I swivel to that key position, my rod's at the perfect angle here. Where most people have problems is the forward cast is following through too much. So when you make your forward stroke, notice how my top hand, my top arm is still bent. Okay, it's still bent at not quite a 90-degree angle, but pretty close. Okay, so if I'm following through, if I'm pushing with that top hand, I'm going to get too much rod travel, so my stroke length is going to be too long. So with these little short lines, my forward cast should be very short and compact. And if I'm using the right amount of bottom hand, it's going to deliver that line effectively, and it's going to create a good cast. So keep an eye on that stroke length. It'll show up in your forward loop. If your loop's open, your stroke was probably too long. So to tighten that loop up to make a good cast, check that stroke length, swivel to the key position, don't follow through, stop sooner in that forward cast, and you'll deliver a nice cast.